Good day to you. What kind of a student are you in general here at ESU? Are you a student who, for example, follows a kind of philosophy like work hard, play hard? In other words, do you work really hard, but when you go out, you really party hard? Are you a student who's really serious about your studies? You spend a lot of time at the library, you spend a lot of time at the university center with a book open, you're constantly highlighting your notes? Are you a student who decides to take the path of least resistance, that you don't buy your textbooks for class, and you somehow find a way to get through those classes without your teacher knowing that you're not doing the readings? Are you a student who works really, really hard on papers, but when it comes to exams, you don't do so well? Are you a student who likes to learn in groups? You like to get together with other people in your major, and you like to discuss the ideas and study together before an exam and share notes with each other? Are you a student who goes MIA for days and weeks at a time, missing classes with the idea that you just really need to get the C or the D, and that going to class is not that important? And there's a lot of different students I've just described there, as well as many others that I haven't described. And all of those students, yourself included, have a kind of philosophy for how you're approaching your education. And that philosophy is your outlook and how you might behave as a student. It could be influenced by who's paying for your education, whether it's you, your parents, whether it's student loans, whether you're on scholarships. It could be influenced by the kind of person that you want to be in life, whether school occupies a small portion and that maybe another portion, maybe larger, is mixing with other people, getting to know other people, growing up and experiencing things. These are philosophies. And much like you have a philosophy about your studentship here at East Stroudsburg University and beyond, media systems are born out of philosophies mostly developed by governments. And so that's what this chapter is on. Chapter 5, it's on philosophies for media systems. And in the old way of looking at philosophies for media systems, we used to talk about them in a kind of judgmental way. We used to say that this is how a media system should operate in order to serve a country. Well, since this book is a rhetorical book, it has a rhetorical perspective, we try not to make those kind of evaluative judgments. So we're really looking at what a philosophy says a country might have as a media system. And a philosophy is that part under the ground, just like the cultural characteristics were the soil surrounding a tree. The philosophy is the roots of the tree. All those trees out there, if you want to look at them as media systems, they all have roots. Remember, the roots can be double the size of the part of the tree that's above the ground. So philosophies can run really deep and can occupy a huge mass in the overall mass of the tree. So we're continuing to dig down underneath the tree as a media system to learn what philosophies are. And I just want to say before we get going on the different kinds of philosophies in this chapter that the countries in this book and the countries across the world don't fall into one and only one philosophy. One of the philosophies that we're going to be talking about is the communist philosophy. You would never think that the USA has anything communist about it, but it does. There are some things that the USA adopts that have a communist philosophical bent to them, just like there are things in China that have a libertarian philosophical bent. So don't think of these philosophies as exclusive. Think about which is the philosophy that tends to dominate a particular country as we go through the material. And we'll start with the first philosophy, which is the authoritarian philosophy. Authoritarian philosophy is one of the oldest philosophies. It actually goes back to Plato. And then later it had a kind of a reincarnation with Machiavelli, the philosopher from Italy that later became a kind of hero of Adolf Hitler. Authoritarianism involves the philosophy that there is an ordained ruler of a society. It could be a person or it could be a group of people, or an ordained ruler, somebody who becomes a ruler by blood. They're born into it. Or they're appointed by an executive council, or they have kind of a religious title, priest or higher, that makes them the chosen one. So the ordained ruler knows more than everybody else, has a direct connection to a god usually, and therefore deserves obedience on the part of the public. The public must respect that this person knows more than they do and give them their obedience and acquiescence. Authoritarian philosophies tend to grow up in societies that perceive themselves to be vulnerable. Maybe they're surrounded by countries that have aggressive instincts. A country like Lebanon has countries around it that it perceives to be encroaching on them, like Syria, for example. So the authoritarian philosophy grows up in countries that feel that they could, if they're let their guard down, be invaded. Authoritarian philosophies also grow up in countries that have internal struggles, civil wars within a country going on, or the potential for starvation. So because of this perceived weakness and the perception that you should not let your guard down, these countries believe that they need a strong ruler, somebody who can take a grip on the country and push it forward. Now, in these countries, the media systems are normally privately owned. They're not owned by the government. Sometimes you find authoritarian societies, communist societies, one of them, in China. But for the most part, authoritarian societies and media are privately owned. You'll find that in Russia, for example. The media are privately owned, but it doesn't mean that they're not controlled by government. Private ownership is a very important part of authoritarian philosophy. Also, there is an idea called the immunity of the state. That means the state cannot be criticized. If the state gets criticized, then people will lose its confidence in the state and its willingness to serve the state, and so therefore the whole entire country could come crashing down. So there's an automatic immunity that you must not criticize the state. If you do, you will lose the integrity and the authority of the state. Now, to enforce authoritarianism, there is something called censorship in the media. And that means that media are not allowed to publish certain things. Again, coming back to criticisms, my dog is down there, coming back to criticisms of the state. That's something that's not allowed. So if there is a newspaper article coming out that's criticizing the state's latest trade agreement with another country, then maybe the authoritarian government is going to X out that article before it even gets published in the newspaper. Now, if somebody does break the law and puts out media content that's against the state's desires, then there are really harsh penalties, including one which is called seditious libel. Seditious libel is a kind of treason against the state, and it's punishable by really severe offenses, including imprisonment and death. So authoritarianism is, you would think, oh, who would ever want to have that? But you know what? Actually, after 9/11 here in the United States, we had a kind of an authoritarianism called the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act gave the government the right to monitor everybody's phone calls who made phone calls to other countries. That's an authoritarian exercise. Why? Because after 9/11, the U.S. perceived itself to be very vulnerable, and for good reason, to foreign attacks. So authoritarianism exists even sometimes in modern countries like the U.S. However, the next philosophy we're going to cover actually grew up as a counter-reaction to authoritarian philosophy. It's the libertarian philosophy. The libertarian philosophy is probably the philosophy that you find operating in the U.S. the most of all. It basically assumes that the individual is responsible for civic participation and the discovery of truth. And what that means is that it's not up to the government to tell people how to believe and how to behave. It's up to the individual to choose that for themselves, and they have to get involved in neighborhood watch groups and sitting on borough commissions and joining parents' teachers associations and coaching baseball games. And that's what civic participation is all about. And through that process, the individual comes to grow and to be an important member of what is normally a democratic society. That's libertarianism. After all, liber, L-I-B-E-R, is the Greek word for freedom. And so that's what libertarianism is really about. It's about freedom from government. It's not to say that government doesn't have a role. Government does have a role. The main role for government in a libertarian philosophy, and we have a libertarian candidate running for president, Gary Johnson, and his running mate, William Weld. The role of government is mainly in defense against other nations, so that there wouldn't be an invasion from another country that would cause harm to your own nation. So that's where the military comes into play as an extension of the government. But the government also has a secondary role, and that role is refereeing to make sure that there is fair play on the part of all businesses, including media. And so that's why you have certain regulations that, for example, prohibit monopolies. The airlines in this country, I wonder if that's something that really should be looked at from the point of view of the government getting more involved, because if one airline raises a cost of a ticket from going from here to Los Angeles, for example, then other airlines will follow suit. and there's not the kind of competition necessarily that will drive down those airline prices. That is a kind of unfair play for smaller airlines, like JetBlue, for example, smaller airline. So the role of government is to ensure that there is fair play, kind of like a referee on a football field, throwing the flag if somebody's holding. That's not fair. The roots of this philosophy can be found in some of the 17th century writings in Britain. Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, they were utilitarians, if you've ever heard of that term before. And there was a deep suspicion about government and government being too authoritarian. That's why libertarianism grew up. And so these people decided that they would advocate for a new system where the individual is the one who's taking responsibility. And to give the individual power, there is private property ownership in libertarian societies. You get to own your own house. You get to own your own business. And when it comes to media, the companies get to own media. Media are not owned by the government. So there's private ownership of media. And the free market is what is supposed to let things play out. It's a question of supply and demand. If there's going to be a need for a presidential debate, like we had last night, then people will be watching it. If there isn't one, people won't be watching it. Now, we're still waiting for the ratings coming in from last night's debate, but it's supposed to have a Super Bowl-size audience. So that's something that perhaps the free market brought to us, was a debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. The free market also then introduces capitalism into libertarianism, the idea of the profit motive. And so that's what you have in the United States for the most part, is you have most of the media system is a profit-making, privately owned enterprise. They're in the business to make money. That's their primary purpose. Also part of libertarianism is self-regulation, meaning that the media should really be making sure that they operate according to a system of ethics and that the government doesn't need to put people in jail and fine them, etc. So the reward is really what is driving libertarianism, the reward to make a lot of money, to become successful, to have freedom, to grow your business. Now we go to a third philosophy. It's the communist philosophy. Under this philosophy, the state is the caretaker for the well-being of society. The state is in charge of making sure that people are taken care of. We find this in China. We find this in North Korea. And it's important under the communist philosophy that people work together as a whole to achieve an egalitarian society. So you don't see a lot of rich mansions. And you don't see any, really, in true, pure communist societies, because there's not supposed to be a big difference between the very poor and the very rich. You don't see mansions, but you also don't see, like we have in Stroudsburg here on 2nd Street. Not that there's anything wrong with living on 2nd Street in Stroudsburg. A lot of students actually rent down there. But it's a pretty poor area. You can see boarded up houses, and a lot of times there's drug arrests going on down there. There's some cars that are broken down that are sitting out in front of houses. You don't see that kind of disparity between wealth. I can remember walking around China quite a bit, and I didn't see any shacks. I didn't see any mansions, but I didn't see any shacks. That's because they're striving for an egalitarian society. The main thinkers who wrote pieces that led to this were Hegel, the German philosopher, and Marx, Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. Under the communist philosophy, there is state ownership of property, no private ownership. So the state owns media properties, it owns houses, it owns buildings. Now, one of the things that is forgotten about communist philosophy is it's very important to elevate the public's tastes. So, for example, programs like the Kardashians, that's not seen as elevating the public's taste. In communist society, they would be programming, because they own the media, they would be programming, producing content for Chinese opera, for example, the melody drama, or symphonies, or intellectual programs discussing nature, or the cosmos, or geography. It's the idea to try and rise up the public's knowledge and taste so that people are not debasing themselves and losing their vocabulary and not thinking analytically and self-indulging in food and entertainment. That does happen in communist societies, but there's more of a drive to try and get people to be the best that they can be from the state's point of view. And the media have a central role in communist philosophy states, because the media are to be teaching communist doctrine, to be teaching about the discipline of communism. You know, it's very, very strange to have a conversation with a Chinese person. They never talk about themselves, but the U.S. person is always saying, oh, I'm doing this, I'm studying this, I'm going to try and get this kind of a job, I was #1 in this, and that's not the way communist people talk, because it's more about what is best for everybody. And so they use we more than I. In communist societies, the penalties are severe. There's censorship like there is in authoritarianism. And there's also prison sentences, and also people can go missing if they criticize the state. The state needs to have allegiance, just like authoritarian philosophy, so criticism of the state is not accepted. Next up is the philosophy social responsibility. This one actually grows up out of the United States, but it's more practiced in Europe. Social responsibility as a philosophy came about because in the late 1940s there was a lot of propaganda in the U.S., mainly in film theaters, talking about killing a Japanese today. It was all part of the war effort. At the same time, the American press started to cover corruption in the United States and to focus on talking about bad news for the most part. And so a professor by the name of Hutchins in the University of Chicago decided to put together a commission to make recommendations for how media could change things so that society could be more uplifting. And they came up with social responsibility, which is where the government is trying to influence media to be fair and balanced and to reduce cynicism, to try and be uplifting. And it's the idea that media have the public's trust. If you own a TV station, if you own a radio station, you have the public's trust, and therefore you have a higher responsibility. That's why, for example, here in Pennsylvania, most radio stations will not report teenage suicides. They won't report them because they don't want to give the idea to other teenagers that suicide is a viable option. And that's something where the media are choosing themselves to try and uplift society rather than report news that may overall be detrimental. And that's an idea, that's a kind of a way of looking at social responsibility. In a social responsibility society, in a social responsibility philosophy, the media are privately owned and they are self-regulating. They choose themselves to edit out content that's going to be harmful to society as a whole. Now, the government does have a role in social responsibility. The government has a role of the bully pulpit. The pounding. If the media don't clean up the kind of profanity and the kind of content they're using, then we're going to have to look at whether we want to enact regulations that will curtail that. That's why we have something like the safe harbor. The safe harbor is that time zone at night where you can, on radio, you can be a little bit more loose with words like damn and hell and bitch and ass, and those kinds of more mild profanity words are allowed during that time period because it's seen as being safer for our children. They're supposed to be asleep. Well, that's what this is about. It's about self-regulation, making sure that you adhere to that as a media organization. The focus of social responsibility philosophy then really is on news, and is trying to get news organizations to have factual coverage, but to put that factual coverage in context. So, for example, if you report an earthquake, you don't just focus on the devastation of the earthquake. You also talk about how that earthquake compares to past earthquakes, the one in San Francisco, the one in Southern California. And then that's going to give people a better idea to judge the proportionality of this particular earthquake because you have context. In social responsibility, a lot of the times the way that they get media to comply is through public admonishment, singling out a company. This company is doing this, and then hoping that stockholders, therefore, the value of the company may go down. The company doesn't want that, so the company is going to comply. It's not going to air programs. Let's just take MTV's program, Ridiculousness, where people could possibly be hurt. Now, that program has never been regulated as far as I know, but there is a certain element of the people who produce that are under restraint. They don't take it as far as they could go, where people end up in the hospital. That is social responsibility at play. And now we go to the two media philosophies that are the newest. They are still sort of growing and maturing, so we don't have as much information on them. The next one is called Developmental Philosophy. The Developmental Philosophy was developed for countries that are developing countries. And by the way, we don't use words like Donald Trump and others used last night, third world countries. That's a very derogatory way of referring to other countries. It's not even saying they're in the first world. Where that comes about is first world countries were countries during the Soviet Union and the United States stalemate days, where all the countries aligned with the United States, Britain, for example, they were first world countries. All the countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union, for example, Poland at that time, were second world countries, and all the other countries that were too weak to be aligned with either one of them and were very vulnerable, they were all third world countries. We don't use that terminology anymore. We use developing country. Those are countries that don't really have the resources to support themselves. They're countries like Malawi. What do you know about Malawi? Probably nothing, right? You probably don't even know that it exists. Maybe you do. Do you know it's in Africa? Do you know it's a landlocked nation? Do you know it's the poorest country in the entire world? Do you know that it could not exist without international aid? Do you know that it has a high rate of AIDS and a very low age for the average age that you live till? That's a developing country. In these countries, the philosophy has grown up that media need to improve the developing country in terms of education, health, infrastructure, the economy, and the government itself. Media should play a role not in knocking down and criticizing, but in building these countries up so that ultimately these countries can achieve stability and autonomy. Autonomy is when they can run themselves. You know, it's like bringing up a child. At some point, the child has to be able to pay for their own expenses and be able to make choices for their health without the parent being involved. That's kind of what developing countries are modeling themselves on. And let's keep in mind that in a poor country, you can't get advertising revenue. Sure, you can try and sell 60 seconds of radio ad, but there's not a lot of companies that are going to have the money to buy that. So media systems themselves, if they're relying on advertising, they can't develop. They need the help of government, and the government needs the help of media. That's a key relationship in a developing media system philosophy, where the government relies on the media not to be too harsh. It relies on the media to promote its education programs, to talk about the uplifting things that are happening, like new roads being constructed, and the media rely on government. The media rely on government to have open access to information so that it can report honestly on where things are going wrong that need to be fixed, and so that the media can also provide information about why decisions were made to spend money here, or to have an agreement with this country there, to develop this program, etc. There's a reciprocal relationship that has to be there between the government and media. UNESCO was a branch of the United Nations. UNESCO, it stands for United Nations Engineering, Scientific, I can't remember all of it, but it's an acronym. And UNESCO had a debate and decided that there need to be some things that happen in a developing media philosophy, such as there needs to be the legal establishment of media freedom. Media need to have that legal right so that they can't be hauled into court and prosecuted for seditious libel, treason, if they criticize the government. Also, there is a government mandate that the government expects media to do things. If the government's going to fund media, if its government's going to subsidize the electricity bills of a TV station, if the government's going to be able to provide a train that will get newspapers from the city to the country, then the government has a right to expect that the media are going to operate in a way that is honest and trustworthy and is not too harsh on the government. Also, another principle of the UNESCO hearings is that the government need to work on exporting media content so that the rest of the world can learn about Malawi and Burundi and all these other very, very poor countries throughout Asia and Africa and Latin America. These countries need to have their story told by themselves, and so that other people learn about them. And finally, international assistance is key. UNESCO, United Nations, and International Monetary Fund, and other private venture capitals, the Clinton Foundation, others, they are involved in providing assistance to these countries to help health education. Something as simple as deodorant is not practiced by people who are in many tribal African countries, and yet it is considered to be essential to health. And so that's something that has to be taught about through the media. It can't be done through advertisements necessarily. It might necessarily need to be done through talk radio programs, which people are able to listen to. Now we come to the final philosophy. The final philosophy also has grown up in the United States, and it's grown up mostly because of technology, and it's just absolutely exploded because of cell phones. I'm talking about the philosophy called the democratic participant philosophy. This is the idea that citizens need to create media content because it's important to the dialogue of a society. You see, in the old days, before there were cell phones, if you wanted to watch media content, it was created by really big TV networks or really big newspapers or radio stations that were owned by huge parent companies like the Clear Channel Corporation or iHeartMedia as they are known today. And so the average person, if you want to put out media content, you don't have the money, you don't have the equipment, you don't have the access. If you wanted to hold a press conference to talk about the parking problem at ESU, who's coming? Nobody, because you're just an average person. And so the democratic participant philosophy says that individual people need to be able to create content. And that's what people are doing today through Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook. They can produce videos on their phone. I know so many musicians, their recording studios are in their houses, and they're able to put out CDs, able to put their music on iTunes, able to create YouTube channels. It's incredible the kind of revolution that has taken place in your lifetime. You have the ability to put out a message. Of course, it's really hard to be discovered because everybody else is trying to do it. That's why people are so keen on followers and Facebook friends and likes and shares. But it's all part of this idea that citizens should be creating content because it adds to the mix. And especially when certain groups have considered to be disenfranchised. They haven't had any power, either through the voting box or just because they haven't been asked. Disadvantaged groups, disenfranchised groups like the poor, or minorities, or minority genders, homosexual and transsexuals, or even students for that matter. When it comes to surveying people, students are not surveyed by consumer polls because it's hard to find them. They have changing addresses all the time. And the elderly, these are disenfranchised groups that need to have better access to media. And it's, again, going against the transnational companies, the big networks that have too much control over media content. So because of things like citizen group pressure, where groups get together, citizens get together, like the Parents-Teacher Council, and try to change the glorification of cosmetic surgery on TV is not really being a viable way that people should approach their health. Citizen groups get together, and they are part of this democratic participant process. It's all about citizen viewpoints and citizen access. So that sums up the philosophies for our media systems. You can examine the countries in the book as well as other countries that you've been to and think about which philosophies are at play given what you know. I'm going to go track down my dog. Have a great day.